Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Permaculture podcast conversation about heat waves and wet bulb temperatures. I'm back with my first live stream in a while, and I have been sitting here for about 15 minutes talking to myself, as sometimes happens, and so now I'm back to talk with you after I've had a few minutes to talk about this and share it with you. Oh man, I love live streams and they're always a lot of fun, but it's different to be back now after all this time. Thank you for those of you who are here, even though I didn't go on air originally as planned, but we'll save it now and be able to enjoy and share it in the future. So the conversation today is about heat waves and wet bulb temperatures. So you can get an understanding of what a wet bulb temperature is if you hear it in the news or in conversation, how that relates to things like the heat index and our understanding of what it's like, of our perception of heat and relative to the actual air temperature and humidity, and to begin thinking about that as we move into the future, because heat waves and heat domes and everything else that comes with them are going to be more regular and prevalent in the future as climate change continues to weird the weather and move what we're doing outside of the traditional climate and weather patterns that we are used to. Before we get into the depth of that conversation, I'd like to thank everybody at Patreon, patreon.com/permaculturepodcast, for their care and support and feedback for me and the show over the months, coming back to a conversation about like where should the show go in live streams and being there and helping me make some of those decisions. Patrons, thank you again so much. I always look forward to your feedback and conversations. And then from there, if you enjoy this conversation today and would like more of these in the future, I always look for your feedback, so please leave a comment in this episode. If you're here for the chat, drop something into the chat and let me know. And of course, as all of us who are participating on YouTube do, smash those like and subscribe buttons, because that's the only way the algorithm is going to find me, and it also helps me know that you liked a particular topic. So let's dig into this, shall we? So, one of my things growing up is when the temperatures would start to get hot here, being a kid in the mid-Atlantic, once I started getting into the 80s, I always had some issues with the temperature. Didn't want to go outside. I'd sweat and I'd sweat and I'd sweat, and I'd feel like I just kept getting hotter and hotter, and I didn't understand why. Because 80, 85 degrees, having been to some places like Florida, didn't seem like it was particularly hot or something that I should be concerned about. But I spent a lot of time struggling in those kinds of temperatures. And so going out there to mow the lawn for Dad to be 15, 20 minutes, come in, get a cold drink, put on a fresh t-shirt, go out, sweat, fill it again, come back in, and just go through this process over and over again, and just be terribly uncomfortable and unhappy when it didn't feel particularly hot. But we would always talk about it being, muggy or humid. And when I was younger, I didn't know about the role that humidity played in our ability to sweat and evaporatively cool ourselves. But that as human beings, with all this skin, that's our easiest way to stay cool, is just to sweat and shed that heat through our sweat. But it's only really effective when with certain temperatures, or when the humidity is at a certain level. And so once the temperature starts to climb, once the humidity starts to climb, our ability to cool decreases. Our ability to just sweat it out and be okay decreases. And so we get more and more uncomfortable. And eventually, there are places where the temperature can get so hot that we can't survive it. Or where the combination of heat and humidity gets so high that we can't survive it. That they are conditions that are incompatible with human life. And that's where I ran into this idea of wet bulb temperatures. That if you take a thermometer, you wrap the base of the bulb in like a muslin sock and get it wet, the thermometer no longer behaves the way that you would expect it to in just still, dry air. And so from that, there are different places where, depending on the temperature and humidity, you achieve the same wet bulb temperature. And a lot of the wet bulb temperature research that I encountered previously said that a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees centigrade, Celsius, which is the equivalent to, let me find that real quick, which is the equivalent of 115 degrees at 50% humidity, is where we cross the threshold of the temperature being incompatible with human life. And so, like, as I looked into that, I also found out, though, that lower temperatures can have lower temperatures with higher humidity, around 95% Fahrenheit at 100% humidity, is the same as this 35 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. And that 95 degrees Fahrenheit at 100 degrees, 35 degrees Celsius at 100% humidity, 95% Fahrenheit or 35% Celsius at 100% humidity is when we cross the threshold where human beings can't shed heat fast enough, and it becomes damaging to us, it becomes dangerous. That is the point at which we can readily die and are at extreme risk and danger. But then, as I looked at that and got that kind of upper level, I started to run across like the heat index, which is a number which is a range that tells us when we have to be concerned about temperatures, and because of the combination of temperature and humidity. And looking at this chart, which depending on your screen, I don't know how well you can see that, but this chart shows that as little as 80 degrees and 5% humidity, 77 degrees as a perceived temperature, is a point at which we should start to begin taking caution. You know, people such as myself who found themselves intolerant of heat, the young and the elderly, are at risk as early as 77 degrees, which doesn't seem like that much. Like, if somebody had asked me, did you think you'd be in danger if you walked outside and it was a 77 degree afternoon, I would never raise my hand. But here's the research from the National Weather Service based on these wet bulb temperatures. And where this gets interesting as well, with these orange bands, the orange band, the dark orange band, and the red band, is that we can be in these ranges very quickly with just a little bit of heat and humidity beyond what we're normally used to and may not be thinking about. Because, if you walk outside and you're in the shade, or you're thinking that the air temperature when you walk out is going to be 85 degrees, okay, no big deal. It's been hotter at the beach. there are a lot of different conditions that can make the temperatures that we are experiencing different from the air temperatures that are being reported, different from the humidity temperatures that are being reported. Because these heat index numbers are reflective of us if we are in the shade and wearing little to no clothing. So, if you have to wear a suit because of your job and it's warm out, you could quickly be in a situation where your personal, like, climate around yourself is substantially warmer than what you see in a chart like this. Or one that I've experienced recently as I experimented with, like, how hot does it really feel as I'm walking around town, knowing what the temperature, the air temperature and humidity are. Walking down a line of trees or a section of road that has no trees, no cover, no shade, standing in the sun is a different calculation than what you see in this chart, because it's considered just being exposed to air temperatures, not solar gain, and the extra energy we take in when we stand in the sun. I think about not only walking down a tree-lined versus treeless street, but standing on a street corner waiting for a light to change. Mid-afternoon, 2, 3 o'clock, after the streets, had all day to absorb all that energy from the sun into the black tarmac, and how I'm standing there feeling that wave of heat off the ground radiating back into me, and how that changes the space that I'm in and my personal perception of heat, and the risk that I could be putting myself in, even though, some of these numbers are not that high. It's also become interesting to me, as I did more research, that these numbers from the National Weather Service are based on that 35 degrees C or 95 degrees Fahrenheit at 100% humidity wet bulb perception. And that it's also reflective for people who are young, healthy, don't have any pre-existing conditions, are in pretty good shape. But that new research coming out of Penn State, which I will link to in the show notes for this episode, or this live stream, I'll include them there later, that new research is showing that 35 C, 95 Fahrenheit wet bulb temperature, 100% humidity, is actually too high. And that we should, for something like this heat index, just get rid of this red range and move all of these other temperatures down a color, so that the yellow starts at extreme caution, or the yellow caution should actually be where extreme caution starts. The orangish extreme caution should be the dark orange, and the dark orange should be our new red, because as little as 31 degrees C and 87 degrees Fahrenheit at 100% humidity is dangerous to human life and puts us at serious risk. And I wanted to bring all of this to everybody's attention through this live stream because of the possibility that we're going to have more events like this, more extreme heat events in the future, and that there are places that do not historically have these kinds of temperatures. We're seeing that more and more regularly. There are places that are used to these kinds of temperatures that they're only going to become more extreme. And the strain that these temperatures are going to put on the systems that exist, and the role that we as permaculture practitioners can have on changing the conversation, that we can work with local government in order to create systems that lower the air temperature of where we live. That if we're in cities, we can do things to reduce the heat island effect. Painting roofs white, planting street trees to provide shade when people are walking around can lower our experienced or perceived temperature by 5 or more degrees Fahrenheit, which can make a huge difference for folks. We can look at ways to dress differently for the weather if we need to go outside. Advocating for alternative work schedules when it's going to be really hot or dangerous for ourselves, so that we can be out of those conditions as much as possible, that we can work on setting up things like cooling centers and free public transportation to get people to those spaces if the temperatures are going to be really high. And just, yeah, there are a lot of different ways that we can engage in this, but as always, I think that it starts with ourselves at home. What tools are we finding useful as the temperature continues to go up? When we experience a heat wave, how are we changing our lives in order to make that more bearable? What is the most useful changes that we have done for ourselves and our families or our friends to get through it? If you're in a place right now that you're experiencing one of these heat waves, what are you doing? I have friends who live in places that don't have air conditioning, where it is in, the low to mid 90s right now. And they've talked about at night, even though it's not getting super cool, opening up all the windows and letting in as much cool air as they can in, and closing those windows and closing their blinds during the day to minimize the solar gain in their homes, and to capture and trap as much of that cool winter or evening air, or that cool, not winter, is capturing as much of that cool evening and night air, so that it limits the amount of heat that is in their space during the day. Traveling less, not going out in the sun. For me, I wear a big broad hat when I go outside, so I can kind of carry my shade with me. If you've ever seen, Victorian women with their parasols, they are a tool and a technology which keeps the sun off of you, and there are companies that make modern parasols with sun reflective material that I think are really neat and pretty reasonable to protect yourself from the sun if you need to go out and walk around. Myself, I love like linen and other fabrics that are really good at helping, capture sweat and move it away from my body. I find that linen tends to work a lot better than a lot of our modern performance wear and things like that, but dressing for the weather that we're in is a valuable tool and a good lesson that I've been learning as the heat comes back, and I'm just trying to exist in it sometimes, and be able to move around. It's tough, even today I'm looking at it and our air temperature is 33 C. Yes, I know a lot of listeners and viewers are Americans, but because the rest of the world, I've converted to metric as much as possible wherever my work is. So even my thermometer app is there. But yeah, it's 33 C, the low 90s, and I walked out this morning before it got hot, or the sun was very high, and just, soaked my shirt in the time that it took to go walk to the grocery store and back. I was thankful, though, even then, to have some of these materials, to have the big hat with me. But we are going to experience this more and more going forward. And how do we do what we can to transition from the world that is to the world that is? We are in the world that is. We are already in a world that experiences heat domes and heat waves, and have for a long time, but we are experiencing it as it gets worse. As the temperatures are higher, the humidity is higher, the wet bulb temperatures are historic in different areas, and that heat waves last longer, and that these domes are bigger and wider and broader, and so we all have more heat to deal with. And I don't know what the future is going to hold, and I can't forecast for it. I don't feel like I'm a prognosticator, but what I can say is that we know what's here now. We can guess pretty well what's going to be coming. So, as designers, let's work with what we have and what we expect and do the best now and in the future. Let's experiment with making the area where we are more habitable and easier to live in. Let's work on lowering these temperatures and advocating for these different things, because I don't think that just saying, oh, well, everybody should have air conditioning and we can use technology to get over this, that's going to create such a strain on the systems that we have and require so much more capacity when there are so many things that we can do now to lessen that burden on ourselves, our communities, and the communities that are not historically ones that are prepared for this. And yeah, that's where I just see a lot of work that can be done as permaculture practitioners, preparing for the heat that is and the heat that's coming. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this and what you're doing to make a more hospitable world where you live and through what you're doing in regards to heat and heat waves and these increasing temperatures and humidity. So if there's something that comes to mind because you're here right now and you want to drop that into the chat, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll begin to wrap up this live stream, draw it to a close, and then host another one of these here in the near future. I think the next one of these is the one that I had mentioned before about let me see if I can find this real quick. Of course, I think about this and I don't have it in front of me, but Meliadora Publishing, and let me see if they've got it. But I want to do the episode on let me pull this up real quick. Jane Webster's Essential Bushfire Safety Tips will be the next live stream. It'll probably be another midday like this, probably on a Thursday in August. Once I have a date for it together, I will let folks know on Patreon, which if you are a Patreon supporter or a patron, you'll find information about that in an upcoming update at patreon.com/permaculturepodcast. If you're catching this and are not a patron and would like to join so you can get those updates and everything else, you can go there and sign up for a year for as little as $10 and change US and get my weekly updates and information about what's coming down the pike, and then when exactly those will be. Probably the next will be sometime in mid-August, one more, and then I will start to add. We'll see how those go, see what interest is, and consider adding more live streams and different conversations in the future. But thank you for everyone who came and joined me for this conversation about heat waves and wet bulb temperatures. I'll be back with you again soon, and take care of yourself, the earth, and each other until we meet again.